Where'd it go? Got it. So what's this one called? Not that one. So there's my error from the terminal.
Okay, where is your, so let's scroll up a little bit.
I might not, maybe I didn't copy it all, but that I just took out the list of the students.
Yeah, so that's
Yeah.
what it's saying is it's right here. You're calling this variable, which would be list, right? Assuming that list is equal to some sort of list here. But from the code you have, you actually don't have any variable called list. Remember, this name right here is not associating to the data type. It's the actual name. So it could be unicorn or cupcake or whatever you wanted. This is just saying, so it would say maybe the length of, so for I in, so here you have for I in students, and then you have 0 and length of list. All you would have to say is for I in students. So you can get rid of this. The 0 and the length of list is when we start with range. So let's just get
Just
rid of
delete.
that. Yeah. Let's see what that looks like. Save it and run it. Press up on the arrow key.
Up
You
on
just
the
press
arrow
up,
key.
it'll do the most recent. So if you go down here and then go down to your terminal and then press up on the arrow key.
Up on the arrow key. I'm sorry. We're
Yeah,
on
so-
these.
So nope, you can just do it in the same one. So see where you've typed Python? Yeah, right here.
Yeah.
Just press up on your arrow key. And it'll start
Up.
iterating through your last, your last one. So if you have, if you mistype or something, and it's a super long one, it's a super nice
Wow.
tool
Wow.
to be able to go instead of having to retype every single time.
Oh, I
Okay.
didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So now it's saying for key val in list, again, we're referring to some value that I don't have. So it's not list of I, right? I represents the entire dictionary. So students is my list of dictionaries, right? Just like this, etc. What we're doing here is when we're saying, actually, we have for value in students. And what that is doing is that is iterating through each dictionary, and each dictionary, it's going to start at 0 and then it's going to go all the way through my list. And each one is value is going to represent this guy. And then once it gets done with the for loop, value is going to then represent the second one, and so on and so forth. So what I would do is actually, let's get rid of this for I in students piece.
just
Mhm.
delete that.
Yeah, you delete that.
Okay.
Cool. And then let's go ahead and take these all back one.
All right. Is output okay over there, or does it need
Yep.
to line
And
up?
then these ones, just these two.
Just line up with print, or does it back
And then
over
your
underneath
print, you're wanting to print the output. Output is, yeah, let's just do this one. Okay. So we're saying for value in students, and that's going through every single that's in my list, and it's going to keep track of every dictionary, right? Then what I'm saying is, okay, now I want to iterate through my dictionary. And what's keeping track of my dictionaries from line 8?
the function or
This guy.
the value.
Yeah. So value is just a word. Again, it could be unicorn, it could be dictionary, it could be whatever you wanted it to be. But this is keeping track of in my for loop, it's keeping track of all these dictionaries. So what I would say is for key val in, and then I want to target my dictionary. So I want to say value dot items, not list of I. So where list of I is, let's go ahead and put value. because value is what's keeping track of my dictionary.
And do I still need this?
You do not need that. Because I is not keeping track of anything. We're not going through a numerical value because we are doing our list in this particular way. We're doing for value in students. Again, value represents the first iteration of my for loop. Then once it gets down to here, value is then going to represent this guy and so on and so forth until my entire list is done. And then let's even think about this here, right? Let's do my T diagram. So I'm going to say V for value. So with this guy right here for value in students, V is going to start at 0, right? Because we started at 0 here, and that's going to represent this guy right here. So we're going to call this 0, 1, 2, 3. Let's just call those arbitrarily. So V is going to be 0, right? 0
Okay.
representing this entire dictionary, not necessarily the number. Make sense?
Yeah, just,
Cool.
well, 0 represents that first line. with
First line,
the-
yeah. So then we're going to say, okay, V represents this first line. V is value. For key, comma, val, because I want to get both the key and the val, all the keys and all the values in value dot items. So we're saying in this lines, because value represents the first one, I want the keys and the values from that first line. So then it's going to iterate through them and it's going to add them to my output, right? That's what my for loop does. It's going to go to this guy and this guy, then that guy, and then it's going to do it for however many keys and values I have. Cool.
Okay,
Then what it's going to do is it's going to come here. So this for loop is done. This guy, right? It's done all the keys and values. It's going to print my output. Then it comes back up here. My for loop's not done because we haven't gone through my entire list. And now my V doesn't represent 0. It now represents 1. So my value has moved to this guy. So then it goes down and says, okay, output's a new string. So we're getting rid of, we are redefining output and we're getting rid of the previous, things that were added on line 11. And then we're saying, okay, let me get rid of some of this stuff here. I want to iterate. Remember, value now represents 1. I want to iterate through this and I want to get all my keys and values. So it's going to print first name, John, last name, Rosales. It's going to print the output. For loop's going to come back up because the condition's not been met, right? We haven't gone through my entire list. And now my value equals 2, which is representing this guy right here. It's going to do the same thing over. It's going to assign my output. So it's going to get rid of all this that I just had created. Then I'm going to iterate through the dictionary that 2 represents. It's going to print the output. Then V is going to be 3, right? Representing this guy. It's going to go through, redefine my output, iterate through that dictionary, its key and its values, create that as my output, print it. And now, because I've gone through my final item in my list of students, this for loops condition has been met and then it's done. And then it goes on to line 13. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yes, I mean, going through on the loops, I got that part. I guess, let's see, and then on the line 9, where it says output equals the quotes. So is that the same quotes that's on line 11 after the F?
Yeah. So what's happening is for every iteration of value, remember it was 0, 1, 2, 3. What's happening is it's creating this new variable called output, right? Or it's creating a variable called output and it's setting it equal to an empty string. Then we iterate through and to that empty string, we add our key and our values. Then we print that string, right? Which is going to contain first name, John, last name, Rosales. Then when it goes up and reassigns our value now to 1, we are then saying output is equal to an empty string. So output equaled, the key and the value. And then when we get to this line 9, we're basically erasing that value and just setting it back to an equal or back to an empty string. Saying, forget about what I had. Now I'm reassigning this variable to the value of an empty string. And then again, we iterate through and then we redefine our output to this specific value. We print it, it goes up, value changes to 2. We say, okay, get rid of that. Let's just set it to an empty string. I want a new slate. Then we add it, print it, and then we keep doing the same thing to 3. And then the conditions have been met because my entire list has gone through. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool.
Yes. I have to keep like just looking at this and seeing how they're placed.
Yeah.
Probably one of the things that throws me the most with all this is that I can assign these terms and staying consistent with the terms as I assign them. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, there doesn't seem to be, there's not like a book with parameters or like here, use brush 1 for this, brush 3 for this.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And so that's just, that's the difficult part for my head.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. And algorithms are hard. So what we're actually going to do, unless somebody has something really dire, is I have sort of reserved all of today and then for the office hour and then all of Thursday's office hour. Thursday's office hour, we're going to talk about a little piece of something. But what I've done is I have reserved that to really continue to walk through this stuff. And so I did create on our platform, just because this stuff does get easier with practice. I did go ahead and I created, let me pull it up. Give me 1 second. I went ahead and I created this additional algo practice, and it's basically just extra algorithm questions. I'm going to be going through them in class, and then you're actually going to be having a guest lecturer on Thursday. I'll be out of town. That's going to walk through these. So it is recorded, but just that way we can show you, here's how I would accomplish this. Here's how I would walk through this, because it just is practice will help. So I hear that. Right. And I did create this for you guys. So that way there's a little bit of extra practice. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and jump in. So I thought today is going to be a little bit more of me explaining, because I feel like there's some foundational stuff that, I want to make sure that we understand before we move forward, because there's going to be some foundational stuff you will need in order to do Flask, in order to do a full stack application that, Web Fundamentals was supposed to speak on it a little bit. Not sure if they did or not, but just want to make, regardless, I just want to make sure that we are at a point where we fully understand and feel comfortable creating functions, fully understand and feel comfortable creating methods, iterating through a dictionary and a list. So I've got some of these questions here, and this is sort of a working document that I thought maybe I would just do in class. Maybe I'll do the first one, and then we can sort of pair program. You guys can teach me, or basically I can act as a driver and you tell me what to do. So that way we can start just getting used to processing through this. Now, there is a few things I do want to just go ahead and introduce to you. Maybe it's a reintroduction, so maybe you've already heard it. Maybe this is the first time you're hearing it. So I just wanted to reintroduce a couple things, or introduce for you for the first time, a couple things. Okay. So the reason we care about this stuff is, A, we're going to be iterating a lot. We're going to be using lists a lot. We're going to be using dictionaries a lot. That is going to be a massive data type, a composite type that we deal with throughout programming, right? Dictionaries, or they're called objects I believe they're called objects in JavaScript, or arrays / lists. They're the same thing, but each language sort of uses them, right? There's some foundational steps that we have to know how to deal with, how to iterate through, and how to use, because any tools that we're using at our companies, any APIs we're calling, they're oftentimes most likely going to be like a dictionary. So I want to make sure that we really can target certain things and deal with that. Also to think critically, learn how to kind of approach problems. And at the other end of the spectrum is when you apply for a job, there's a couple avenues you can go, right? There are companies that don't do what we call whiteboarding. Now, whiteboarding is basically, it comes, I mean, it's kind of a pre-COVID term. But back in the day, if you were to apply for a job and you were to go, they would they'd give you an algorithm and you would have a whiteboard that you had to solve it on. Basically, you had to solve it by hand. You didn't do it by code to where you could, put in some pre-built stuff, or it didn't give any sort of help. You just had to do it by hand, and maybe it ran or maybe it didn't. But more so, companies want to see how you process, how you think out loud. Can you improve on something? Maybe your first step is one way, and then can you improve that process? Can you make it quicker? There's something called time and space complexity, which I'm not going to hit on now, because you are going to get that in projects and algorithms, but it's really starting to get your feet wet of, okay, I'm used to doing algorithms. I'm used to sort of thinking and taking keywords and understanding what those mean. And that's what the whole point of this is. So if I'm looking at this one's called Biggie size. And so here's the question, right? Given a list, write a function that changes all positive numbers in the list to the string of big, right? And so what a person will do, right? A recruiter or maybe a technical manager, whoever you're meeting with, is they'll give you this and you'll have to then write the code. Now, one thing to know, and it's more like they're not going to tell you necessarily to do this, but it is an unspoken rule, is you don't just immediately go start coding because they want to see how you think. People still get a job even if they don't answer it correctly, right? Even if you don't end up getting the correct answer, you can still get a job because they like the way you think critically, the way you kind of process through things. And also, more importantly, the way you're able to explain it. It's a big thing in the development world, is not only can you write really good code or write good code or adequate code, but can you explain it, right? A lot of people can really, really just type, but then they can't explain anything. And that doesn't help, right? Because you need an entire team to maintain a code base, not just one human, because let's say that one human gets really, really sick or leaves the company. And now there's a bunch of people who don't know how the code's run and they can't really work on it, right? And so they want to see how you process through that. A big way in this unwritten rule we talked about is using something called pseudocode. Pseudo code. And the idea behind pseudocode is before you even start actually coding and taking in and writing def and, your function name, et cetera, you process through and you sort of write out your steps in just plain English or whatever, your native language is, where you start writing out, this is what I need to accomplish. And this is really going to be the big piece on where they say, okay, can they problem solve? Can they code? Do they think of something called edge cases? We'll see a couple of these like down here. With this one would be what we call an edge case. I'll talk about that when we get there. But more so, it's you sort of writing out every single step of what does this look like? And then from there, the last step is you actually put it all together and you actually code. So from a pseudocode perspective, again, I'm writing out steps, and it sounds silly at the beginning, right? My first thing I'm going to say, you're going to say, obviously that's like, duh, but do it in practice, continue to practice it. But my first step is, given a list, write a function that takes all positive numbers in the list to big. My first thing is I'm seeing this that says write a function. So I know that my first step is going to be write a function. Now, here there's a keyword called given a list, or it starts that says given a list, or takes a list in. That's another word. That's basically saying is your function is going to have a parameter, right? That it's going to need to have a list as a parameter. So I'm going to say, write a function that has a list as parameter, meaning our function must take in some sort of value, right? Cool. Now, what am I going to do? All right, so I create my function. It has a word that says list or whatever, array or ARR, listy, whatever you want to use. But now what do I need to do? Well, it's saying that I need to change all positive numbers in the list to big. And if I want to do that, that tells me I'm going to go ahead and I need to check every single number to see if it's positive or negative. So for that, I'm going to create a for loop to iterate through all numbers. Right? Because I don't know if this is going to have negative integers or not. If it does, great. If it's all negatives, okay. I still need to check it. Cool. So I know that I'm going to use a for loop to go, and I want to check every single one because a for loop is great for doing a repetitive task, right? Instead of me saying if array at position 0 equals or is greater than 0, you know, blank. If array at position 1, instead of having this massive conditional statement, doesn't really make sense, right? Because what if I've got 500 elements in there? I've got to write this massive if, but what if, you know, what if the list I do pass only has 50? So you can see that I need to just go ahead and use a for loop because it can grow or shrink with however long my list is. So I'm going to create a for loop to iterate through all numbers. Then I'm going to create if statement to check if the number is positive or negative. Then I'm going to say if the number is positive, change value to big. And then maybe I just want to, at the end, I just want to return back that list. Okay. So my pseudocode is just in English, right? It's just how you and I would talk. First, I need to write a function that has a list as a parameter. Then I need to create a for loop to iterate through all of the numbers, or through the list, I guess would be a better thing. Create if statement to check if the number is positive or negative. If the number is positive, change the value to big. And then at the end, I want to return the list. And what's great about having pseudocode is then I can sit and say, okay, I can go step by step and actually just write the code for each step. So in this case, it says write a function that has a list as a parameter. So I'm going to say def big E. I like to just say the whatever that's called. Now I know that it takes in something, and list can be a keyword in Python. So usually you like to say like listy or something different than list. But okay, I've done the first step, right? I've written a function that has a parameter. Perfect. Now I need to create a for loop. So what I'm going to say is for I in range, because I can say len of listy, right? Remember, listy represents the list I'm going to pass in, and I want to go through all of it. I want to start at 0, and I want to go through however big it is, right? I don't want to put a number of 500 because what if my list only has 2 items in there, right? Then that's going to be a lot of time my computer's using checking and creating a number that doesn't make sense or it's not in my list, and I can get an error. But by me saying for I in range, I just represents the number, right, of the length of list. This is going to be dynamic, meaning it's going to grow and shrink. However long my list is, my range changes. Now, okay, I've done that. I've done this guy. Perfect. Check. Check if statement. Check if statement to check if number is positive, or create if statement. Sorry, to check. That's why I was confused. Create if statement to check if number is positive or negative. So then what I can say is if. Now my number, because I'm using a range, I just represent 0, and then it's going through the number of my length of my list. So if my list has 5 items, it's going to be 0 to 5, right? So I just represents that value of the number. So what I can say is if listy of I is greater than 0, then what do I want to do? Right? So my condition is if the value in my list at position I, it's going to start at 0. So if the first position is greater than 0, then I want to say listy of I, because that's that position that is greater than 0 equals big. And it's lowercase. I'm not doing anything, right? If it's negative, I'm just leaving it. So then here I'm on the same level. So my for loop's going to run through, and once it's done running, my entire for loop's done running, it's going to go to line 15, and then I can say return listy, and that's going to return that list that I've now modified. So let's try it. Let's say I've got a list of So I'll just say R equals -1, 2, 3, -8. Cool. So here's my function. If I were to run this, nothing's going to happen because I actually have to call this, right? So what I can say is I can say, I want to print it because I'm not actually, let's print listy and then we'll return it. Oops. So I don't have to print my function. So then now if I were to just call that and say Biggie size, I have to pass it a value, right? Here I'm going to say ARR. Now if I run this, this is office hour.py. It's going to give me -1, big, -8, because it changed all the positive numbers to big. Any questions on this? Did this make sense?
Just a quick question. Whenever you use an if statement, do you have to throw in an else?
You do not.
Okay.
No, you can, but you do not have to.
Okay.
So when I was talking about an edge case, right, a great question here would say an edge case is like a unique case, a unique. So when I'm saying like, oh, think of edge cases, it's like, what could break? What are some questions I actually need to ask my technical, interviewer? So one thing I would say is that changes all positive numbers. Does 0 count as a positive number? Right? Because right now this is set to greater than 0. But if I were to do this and call this, let me save it and then call it, it's going to give me 0, right? So a good edge case would be, hey, what happens? Is it 0 or greater? So is it greater than or equal to 0? Or is 0 not necessarily a positive number? How would you like me to handle that? Would be a great question to ask your technical manager. Any other questions on this one?
How does it, sorry, I'm not seeing where it's finding that it's positive.
Right here?
It's that, I see it down there, but I'm not seeing it in the code there, because you wrote out if the number is positive, change the value to big.
Mhm.
And so if it's greater than 0, but where did it tell it that it's positive?
Just greater than 0 is representing positive.
I guess I probably would have been hung up on finding some modulo or adding 1 to something.
Nope. Yeah. So in this case, and that's great, right? A positive number would just be anything 0 or 1 and above, right? And then anything negative would be anything below 0. So -1, -6. So here, what I'm saying is if the number is greater than 0, well, I know that it's, 1 through 1 million, right? But that's a positive number. And so therefore I'm going to call it big.
Oh, you know what? Actually, in my head, I was thinking odd or even. And so that I solved it. Now I see what you're doing. I was thinking odd and even. So
yeah, nope, not there. This one's just positive and negative. Any other questions on this?
I'm getting a little confused with print and return. So why did you have to put both?
Yeah, so great question. I didn't have to put print here. So what I want to say, okay, so here's the difference. Here, this print is going to be just, I wanted to see it right here.
Oh, okay.
Right? I could have done something like this, where I printed, and this is just so I could see what it came out to. I could have done this and it'd do this exact same thing. Return means that anytime this function is called, so in this case, here's my function call, the value that call becomes is whatever is returned. In this case is the list that's been modified. So if I wanted to see that, then I need to go ahead and print it. But just to sort of reiterate what I could have done, what you could do is say like X equals Biggie size ARR, right? Now X is a variable that's holding this new value of listy. And then I could say print X. And this will print the exact same thing.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, so X is set to whatever is returned when this function is called. In this case is listy, so X equals this value, and then I could just print it here. So I just did it up there, so I didn't have to say like print parentheses biggie smalls or biggie size, sorry. But either one would work just fine. Just more to see what it looked like.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, but if I would have done it after my return, remembering that a function, anytime a function sees a return, it's done running. Even if there's 150 lines within associated to that function, once it hits that return, that function is done running.
Got it.
And if you don't put return, it just prints blank, right?
Yeah, it wouldn't.
Yeah.
So let's see if I just didn't do anything. If I commented this out, my function doesn't return anything. Just none. Because it doesn't, if you don't return anything, that's just, its value is none.
Cool.
Oh, and so one more thing. For the array, does it have to go on the bottom or it can go on the top as well?
It could have gone anywhere. It could be
Okay.
anywhere. I just called it ARR.
Got it.
It could have gone up there, could have gone anywhere. As long as it's declared before this function is trying to call it. Cool. Let's move on to the next one. Go ahead.
Oh, actually, can I just real quick on,
Yeah.
I'm back on that. So, and I apologize for this, probably like a super newbie question,
No, good.
but sometimes like for like, where it's like the for loop, where it's like for I in range length listy, something like if, like what is I, so like, I feel like sometimes in some prior examples, like when I'm just coding by myself, sometimes if I feel like it'll just return like 0, 1, 2, like the 0,
Mhm.
1, 2, 3, 4, right? For I.
Yeah.
At like the index numbers, but not necessarily like what's in it. So then, and I get through repetition because I've done it so many times, like listy, and then you have to put I in, but I'll be honest, I don't understand why it works. So if you might just
Yeah.
for a second.
Yeah, great question. So when I use range, then I'm saying I have some sort of numerical value here. Length of listy in this case is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So len of list, if I were to print, let's just do that real quick. I wanted to print, let's just say. I need this. Oops. I would just to print this. Len of listy. Híjole. It's gonna give me the number 5. This value is just 5. And if you remember, our range can take up to 3 things, right? So range has your start, stop, and step. Right? That's what it can take. But if I just pass it one thing, in this case, the len of listy, it just says where to stop. Because remember, this defaults to 0 and this defaults to 1, right?
Oh, yep.
Cool. So then here I'm saying for I in range, and you can sort of think as if I said range of 5. So I is going to represent the iterator, right? The step, the thing I'm keeping track to increment. So if I were to T-diagram this at the beginning, right? I is going to represent 0 because that's where range has it starting at.
Mhm.
Then it's going to do whatever the for loop says to do. Then once it gets to that point, right? So in this case, once it gets to here, then it's going to go back up. My for loop condition has not been met, right? Because it's going to check and say, you know, are we at the point where the length of listy is no more, right?
Mhm.
It's not the case. So then I becomes 1 because it's stepping by 1 because I default didn't put anything, right? Steps by 1. So I becomes 1, does all this. Then it comes back. I becomes 2. So I is just representing a numerical way to keep track of where I'm at in my array. Now, why that comes in handy is right here. If I were to say listy of position 0, you could probably tell me what that equals, right? -1.
Mhm. Ah,
I
so
were
it's
to say,
just holding the value, like it's holding that
yeah,
place for that value to pop in. Okay,
yeah.
that makes sense now.
If I were to
Okay,
say listy of 1, it's going to be 2, etc., etc. So that's why I can say listy of I. All I is doing is going from 0, which is the start of my array, all the way through the end of my array, and just keeping track of that value. So then I can say, listy at whatever position I is.
and then that's
And this-
the output that it
And then
measures
it's going to
against
give
in that
you,
for loop.
it's like it's saying, let's say it was at the beginning, right? The very first iteration. If I say
Mhm.
listy of I, that's going to be the same thing as me saying, because I say I equals 0 with my T diagram, right? That's going to be the same thing as me saying listy of 0. Right? Because I is 0, so I'm saying listy of 0, where we can say -1. Does that make sense?
Yep, that absolutely makes sense. Thanks, dude.
Oh, absolutely, Chris. Cool. Let's move on to the next one. Okay. So this one says count positives. Given a list of numbers, create a function to replace the last value with the number of positive values. Note that the 0 is not considered to be a positive number. Okay, again, so great. Our edge case here is we know 0 is not considered a positive value. So we can kind of almost build on ourselves here, right? So before I do anything, let's do my pseudocode. So I'm going to create a function that takes in a list, right? I'm going to create a for loop to iterate, because I'll have to check every single number to see if it's positive. CHROU list. Perfect. Now here I need to create an if check. I call it an if check, so it's like a conditional. You can just call it an if check. That's usually what it's called. Create an if check to see it is positive or negative. So I'm going to say if positive. Now, what do I want to do if it's positive? I'm thinking, okay, if it's positive, I want to add it to some tally, right? I need to keep track of how many positive. Add to tally or sum of positive variable. Positive variable. And then at the end, I need to replace the last value in array or in list, sorry, with some variable. Now this one's a little bit interesting, so let's walk through it. So I'm creating a function that takes in a list. So I'm going to say def count positives. Right? It's going to take in a listy. I'm going to call it listy, but it's going to take in a list. It can be anything you want. If you wanted to call it unicorn or cupcake, it doesn't matter. Now, if I were to just do this, if I were to say, okay, for I in range of listy, I can have a little bit of an error. So we've talked about that. Okay, great. I need to basically keep track of my value, right? I need to keep track of how many positives. So I could say something like sum equals 0, right? Because I haven't started yet. I don't have any positive numbers. This could, in theory, have 0 positive numbers. If I do this, can anybody see the issue that would happen? Mike, think of like our output string. What could happen if I keep it within my for loop?
Some will just change back to 0 after every iteration through.
Yeah, absolutely, right? For every single iteration of I'm going to reset my sum equal to 0. So I actually won't keep track of it. And this is something I see a lot of students, especially as you guys are beginning in this. I see a lot of students sort of doing this. But if I've got a value that is needs to be persistent, right? And maybe I want to add to it through my for loop. I want to declare it before I declare my for loop. I can call it because I'm within my function. I can call it within my for loop, but I want to make sure I declare it before. That way it doesn't keep resetting itself. Perfect. Cool. So I've declared my sum. I'm just gonna call that sum. Now I want to do what I have been doing, right? I'm gonna say if listy of I, in this case, it already told us 0 does not count is greater than 0. Then what do I want to do? Well, I want to add 1 to my sum, right? Because I'm just keeping track. I don't want the number itself. I just want to keep track of how many positives. So I can just say sum plus equals 1. And again, that is the same thing as saying sum equals sum plus 1. It's just shorthand. Both work, but I'm going to say plus equals 1. So if it's positive, I want to go ahead and add to my sum. Perfect. Great. So I'm going to do that through my entire for loop. Cool. Now, and I'm going to make sure I get out of my for loop. And what I mean by that is if I'm still indented, I'm still within my for loop, remembering our code block from our Python. So I have to get out of my for loop. I have to be on the same level, right? The same indentation level. So now I've got my sum. Let's say it's going to run through and it's going to have some sort of value, whether it's 0 or 135, doesn't matter. Now I need to be able to target the last value of my list. There's two ways I could do this. One way is if I were to say listy of -1, that's going to target the last value. -1 targets the last value. I'm just going to say that equals sum. And then let's see. What is it saying? Rename this variable. It shadows a built-in. Oh. Let's say pause sum. Oops. Perfect. So if I say -1, that's saying the last value in my list. Pause sum. Let's go ahead and print listy. That's all I need to do. And then let's call count positives. I can return listy if I wanted. Perfect. So let's create my list. I'm just gonna call it lit. That's always fun. So let's just create one. So let's say 1, 0, 2, -9, -8, -5. So this should, in theory, say 1. After this is done, it should say 1, 0, 2. I have 2 positives, so it should have a sum of 2, -9, -8, and then the number 2. So if I were to say count positives, I pass it lit. Let's see what happens. Cool. It goes, it takes all the positives, right? Creates the sum and does 2. Now this -1 is awesome. And that's a great way to target and go from the back. Another way to do this is to say, and I know this seems like a lot, but there's one that I'll show you that it'll make sense. Like when we're swapping values, this is what we want to do. Well, we say len of listy -1. And remembering that len of listy has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So len of listy is going to equate to 6, right? If I say len of listy -1, it's going to run len of listy. It's going to get the number 6, and then it's going to subtract 1 of 5. That's the same thing as me saying listy of 5. And if I were to look, there's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that is another way to do it. I would encourage you guys to get comfortable with this one, because what if I wanted to, change a different value instead of -1, right? This is a way that I can keep track of the end. Again, there's another one that I'll show you that'll actually walk you through that particularly. Any questions on this one? Does it make sense?
Sorry, why are you subtracting one again? Because you needed the parameters were to.
Yeah, so len of listy is gonna give me the length of how many values are in my list.
Mhm,
In this case is 6, right?
right.
So remembering a list starts at position 0. So it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So len of listy is 6 minus 1 is 5. So this is like I'm saying listy of 5, which is going to be this last position. So just knowing if you always say the length of list minus 1 is saying the last position in my list.
Oh, and so in the last position in the list is going to be this summation of this count. That's it? The equals positive sum.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a way that I could say the last one in my list instead of just doing the negative one. Negative one's sort of a cheating version. This is a more succinct way to do it.
And so that it's just a count. So when it returns, so down there in the terminal, when it has 2, this was just a count. This wasn't, when it says sum, it's not 1 and 2 and ended up being 3. It's that the positive numbers there were 2 positive numbers.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's what, so that maybe that was confusing variable naming, but yeah, all it was saying is that replace the last value with the number of positive values.
Okay.
Which is just 3, not the value of those positive, not the summation of those, just the number of them.
Okay. All right. Right.
Any other questions? I got time for maybe one more. Not maybe one more. I could do one more. Cool. So this one's gonna have to be on X Games speed. Let's see. I feel like we can do this one together. Create a function that takes a list and returns a minimum value in the list if the list is empty. All right, I want to do. I'm going to do one that says create a function that takes a list and returns the maximum value and the minimum value in the array. So it's a list, right? So I want to do this one where I can take it and I can say, I want to create a function that takes a list and returns the maximum value and the minimum value in the list. If the list is empty, have the function return false. Cool. So let's do my pseudocode. So I'm going to create a function. function that takes in a list. Now, before I even create my for loop to iterate through, it says if the list is empty, have the function return false. So I'm going to do check to see if the list is empty. If so, return false. Now we talked about creating variables outside my for loop. I see that I need to have 2 variables, right? My maximum value, my minimum. So I'm going to create minimum and maximum variables. Then I'm going to iterate through for loop. So it's got a little bit more. I'm going to check to see if the value is a new min or max. And then maybe I just want to return. Yeah. So then at the end, I want to return the min and max. Cool. Let's work through this one. So I'm going to create a function. So I'm going to say def min max, and it's going to take in a listy. Perfect. So now it says check to see if the list is empty. What I can do is immediately, before I even do any sort of for loop, I can say if len of listy equals 0, right? Meaning that there's nothing in there, return false. Because that's what it told me to do, right? It says to return false. So I'm going to check the length of my listy. We know that that's a number to see how many values are in there. And if it's 0, I just want to go ahead and return false. I don't want to have to deal with that. Cool. Now, if I get to line 90, remembering that if a value or if a function sees a return, it's done. So if I get to line 90, that tells me that something's in there, right? I can't get here if there's not a value in there because it would already return. And then once a function hits a return, it's done running. So now I can do my I actually can create my variable. So I'm going to create it. I'm going to call it min and I'm going to call it max. What do you guys think I should put here for my min and max values? Any ideas? Okay, if I put 0 for both. Okay, that's a thought. What if, though, my array or my list is all negative values? If it's all negative values.
Could you set it to the first index?
Yes,
list?
Aaron, absolutely. So what I could do is I could say listy of position 0 and listy of position 1 or 0, sorry. Now, why am I doing this? Well, I know that I'm going to compare each value in my list and I have to compare them to find out which is the maximum, right? And by doing this, I'm assuring that my minimum and my maximum is alive or is within my list. If I were to do some arbitrary number like a 0 or 100 or -5, what if my list had more negative numbers, like deeper negative numbers than -5? I would never find my true maximum, right? Because nothing's ever going to be better or more than -5 if they're all -100 and negative. Say it's a list of -200 to -100. If my max is -5, none of those values are going to be greater there, right? So I have to make sure that my min and my max actually live within my list. And so by setting it to the first one, worst case, this is not my min or my max. Well, I'm just going to compare and then I will change it. Best case, maybe one of these is right? Maybe this is my minimum and then cool. I got it on the first try. It doesn't really change anything, but all that this does is it assures that my min and my max are within my list. Great job, Aaron. So what I can do now is say something like this. I can say for I in range. Now, if I could just put len of listy here, but I actually want to add another value because I don't need to check 0, right? I don't need to check to see if 0 is greater than 0 because it's already there. So I'm going to go ahead and start it at 1. So I'm going to put that extra value. That's just one less iteration I have to go through using less computational power. So what I can say here now is I need to compare and say, is listy at position 1 greater than or less than minimum, or is it greater than my maximum? So I could say if listy of I is less than my min, then min, I have a new minimum and I'm going to reassign it to listy of I. Now I'm going to say elif here because if it is my new minimum, it's not going to be my maximum, right? So I don't have to worry about like, I'm going to miss my maximum and vice versa, right? If it's my maximum, then I don't then it's not gonna be my min, so I'm not gonna miss anything. But what it does is it allows is if this minimum condition is already made, it actually cuts down on how much code I have to be written. Because if I do 2 if statements, and even if it is my new minimum, meaning that, right, there's a greater value there, even if it is my new minimum, then it's going to go ahead and still do the check to see, well, is this new minimum greater than my current maximum, which we know that that's not going to be true. So what I can say is an elif, which just will help on my runtime, is greater than my max. So, or if it's that, then I can say max equals listy of I. So it's going to run through all my code. It's going to do all of that information. Is it saying that it doesn't like this number? Yeah, it's fine. And then now I'm going to return yeah, it's fine. Now, if I were to say, just take in some values, -1. If I were to say that, and I were to say print min max, pass it lit. Let's see what it does. It says the minimum is -8, which we see from that, that's true. And the maximum is 38. We see that is true. Any questions on this?
Min and max are just built-in functions, right? Or built-in.
Nope, they're just variables. This could be unicorn and cupcake. This
Got
min
it.
and max I just created, that could be unicorn and cupcake, where I'd say basically if listy is less than unicorn, then unicorn now equals the new listy, and vice versa. Those are variables I created.
Got it. Cool.
Any other questions on this?
Yeah, why does it say that it shadows a built-in?
It's your sonar lint, so it's just your linter. So it says, let's view the problem. Name is variable, it shows a built-in. So maybe there's a built-in method to find. I think there's a built-in, so I could look and say like min of a list, and then I think it'll automatically do it. So I would assume that there's a Python function that finds the min and the max. That's what it's saying.
Gotcha,
So if I
thank you.
change like min num, then it's gonna be fine. There, it's just my name calling. Yeah. Any other questions? There, now it won't yell at me. Any other questions on this guy? Cool. Well, let me stop this recording.